Welcome to Knowledge Unbound, everyone. Episode 8. This has been a fabulous season. Want to remind you, it's brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. Once again, I'm here, Sekeva Masai. What are you thinking? What do you think of this run? This 7 into 8th episode run?
Well, it's definitely been quite a string of episodes. It's always crazy to think about the fact that we're this close to the end of this
Why you have to say it like that? You make it sound like it's like a bad book you just want to
cry
finish.
because it's about to end. Smile because it happened.
Yeah, well, and it will happen in perpetuity, right? These episodes will exist. Today was really fun because so we had a conversation with Dr. Sarah Cavanagh, Simmons University. And many people I invite on the show are friends of mine, colleagues or whatever, and I think this was another case where you know somebody pretty well because they're your coworker. I've written, not written grants, but I'm on a grant with her, have projects with her. But when you get into the kind of podcast scene where we just doing an interview and I'm asking you to expand on things and get into certain topics more deeply, invariably you see just a different side of that person, right? And I mean, of course, with her consent, right? But it was really great, and we talked a lot about mental health and her own journey with that. So I learned a lot. She wrote a bunch of books. She's humble, but just a kind of a fantastic scholar and so easy to talk to. I just want to welcome you to today's show. I hope you enjoyed. You learn a lot. We'll see you at the end. Welcome, my friends. Knowledge Unbound. Another great episode, another great guest. I have in front of me Dr. Sarah Cavanagh. I feel happy to have her in front of me because, as you know, what I don't try to do it, I do this. I record my podcast in person. The vibe, the nonverbals, all of that, connecting is just a little bit different when I have the privilege to be next to the person versus Zoom. As good as Zoom is, right? In person is just better. And Dr. Cavanagh was gracious enough to let us use the podcast recording studio at Simmons University. So I am currently at Simmons University. It's one of the colleges of the Fenway in Boston, Massachusetts. It's January. What date's today? January 13th. So it's the exact same temperature here as it is in Miami. It's funny because coming on the plane here, I mean, people looked at me with my winter jacket and thick sweater, yeah, that's a Miami boy going to bus. You're just wearing all these signs of it. But anyway, it's good to see you. It's always good to hang out with you and good to talk about your work. So I think you know this. We talked in the off-camera piece how I introduce guests or don't introduce guests. I want you to tell us who Sarah Cavanagh is.
All right. Well, I am a psychologist. My training is kind of at the intersection of academic and clinical psychology. I am not a clinician. I have no clinical training. I've never seen a patient, but my doctoral work was in post-traumatic stress disorder. And so kind of the intersection of emotion and motivation and mental health struggles. So I focused a lot on post-traumatic stress disorder, especially patients who were recent amputees and also parents of children who had severe burn injuries. And so our question was really, what are the differences cognitively and neurobiologically between people who make it out of that experience without PTSD and people who are suffering years later? And so we're really trying to understand that. But I started teaching as a teaching assistant and then took a Tufts University. I was at Tufts University, and they had a summer program for graduate students and to train them in teaching. I did that, and then I started teaching in their experimental college, and I just could not stop teaching. So I
Sounds familiar.
graduated. I had taught 9 courses as an instructor. I did not have 9 publications or 9 grants, however. And so it became really clear to me that I was headed toward a really teaching intensive career.
What about the teaching made you fall in love with the teaching?
I think everything. I think part of it was I did a lot of musical theater
Okay.
as a kid in high school and summer camps. And I was also famous in my neighborhood for trying to put on plays. So I would,
I'm sensing a theme here, but go on.
yeah, I would gather everyone together and I would write the script and, yeah, and sometimes a parent would have an old video camera and
Okay.
would make a little movie. There was a lot of ghosts. There was a lot of romantic angst, and I don't. It felt a lot like that. It
Okay.
felt from both the emotion and the performance and the synchrony and the ensembleness, like working together to put together a performance, but then also the nerdy stuff, like the planning and the organizing and thinking deeply about structure and how to structure things. And yeah, all of that. I loved the students. I loved the flow and the adrenaline of the actual teaching part, planning the readings. I mean,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe that because, as you know, well, both you and I do this, right? We go to universities and we talk to groups of faculty about teaching different ways to consider their classroom. And of course, as academics, we ground what we say in evidence, right? Here's a study that shows that if you cut content, X and Y and Z can happen. But one thing I tend to not say a lot is that in my own practice, one of my biggest influences was a professor of theater at my first university.
Yep.
And it wasn't so much her. I mean, she was great, right? She was great in every way. But, I didn't grow up doing musical theater, but I did grow up doing music, right? So I played in orchestras. I played classical music, for 10 years of my life. That was kind of the parallel school. So there was school, and then there was a separate school I went to 3 times a week to do that, right? And so all of the things you're talking about, those little details about putting this thing together and have it come out in unison, and it's not just the hitting of the notes or things like that, but it's all of even the physical behaviors, right,
Yeah.
that go into making a sound happen,
Yep.
right? And I'll confess to you, I struggle a little bit talking to STEM faculty about these intangibles, these nonverbals, and how much those things matter for the room to create the effect I want.
Right.
Is there a little bit of that informed by your thespian history, should I call it?
No, absolutely, and so much, and I like the word intangible. It is, and I think I love teaching, but of course I've had courses go poorly, and there is something intangible there too, where you just don't gel with a particular set of students,
Yeah.
so they don't gel with you. It just doesn't work, and so there is somewhat of magic to it, I think,
Yeah.
and a performance element. But I also love that it ends and it ends cleanly.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's so few things
There's
in
an
life.
arc to it. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wraps up every
Right.
December, every April.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it wraps well and sometimes less well, but gets tied with a tidy little bow. And that never happens in research, I feel like.
Yeah.
Never happens in science. Science is never done.
It's never done, and that's good in its own way, right? But it's just a
absolutely.
different experience,
Yeah.
right? All right. I'm gonna stick on the theater thing for a little bit because it's a love of mine as an attendee, by the way. Not I don't have your skills. But a few times I remember this happens in music as well, right? You almost go into a state of flow. Like, yes, the audience is there, and you're on stage, you're 10 feet from them. But when you're in your character, when you're in your instrument, when you're in the piece, when you're in the play, whatever it may be, it's almost like you're just kind of transported to a place. Does something similar happen when you're in the classroom?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I tell my students, so I teach a class in emotion and motivation, and we talk about the psychological phenomenon of flow, where you do that, you feel like you become one with the activity and you cease to be a self, a separate self, and how rewarding that is. And surgeons feel it doing surgery, musicians, athletes, being in the zone. And toward the end of the class, so we talk about flow a couple times in the semester, and I give them some advice from emotion and motivation science on the last day of class. And one of them is find something that regularly gives you flow and then build your career around that. Like do that.
Yeah.
And then I tell them
Well,
that
but do they ask you, how do we find that thing that would give me flow?
practice, experience,
Right.
exposure
Yeah.
to varied things, but with an awareness, like looking for it, you know. And that teaching is where I get flow more than anything else. I can remember times in my life. There's one time in particular that I was very, very upset and just, you know, when something's going on and your brain just circles it and circles it and circles it, and you just can't stop. And I was in that moment. I remember I was just sitting it was my brain and behavior class, and then I got up and I taught, and it just all of that disappeared. It was completely gone, and I felt so much better afterward. And just that one experience sticks out at me. It's almost like therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the reason why I ask, and you know, I'm asking partly because some of the listeners to this podcast are students who, in their own way, are trying to find a place where they can experience flow. And I watch them in a higher education system that is set up to channel you into a thing
Yeah.
before you even know yourself fully.
Right.
Right? You pick a major first semester of college. And look, with all due respect to those who knew they wanted to be a doctor since they were 6, man, I have much love for you, right? But I do lament that not enough space is given to do that exploration, because in the same way you ended up teaching 9 classes, right? I mean, I taught the first semester of my PhD and also loved it. That didn't have to happen, the teaching, that is, right?
Yeah.
It was, everything was set up for me to be a high impact researcher. That's the whole
Yep.
point of grad school. So I just happened to run into this thing by accident that led me to my flow. I just wonder or hope we could be more intentional as an institution to provide students opportunities for that.
Yep.
And I guess first we would have to understand what that is and why it matters.
Yeah. And can I tell you a story? And I'm not going to name any names. I was at one of these speaking engagements that we talk about, and it was at an institution that is highly selective, shall we say, or highly rejective, according to your preferred nomenclature. And they were telling me that they had developed this program for their graduate students that trained them in teaching and then hooked them up with adjunct positions at local, like state universities, community colleges, to kind of meet that need. But the program got shut down. It was working very successfully, but the administration shut it down because too many graduate students were then deciding that they wanted a teaching career and they didn't want to go into research.
Wow.
And it was becoming this pipeline, and the administration said this is going to like hurt our reputation, and they shut it down.
Yeah, there's a famous Hennessy commercial from several years ago, and the tagline is always, "What's your wild rabbit?" Right? What are you chasing?
Yeah.
Right. What's important to you? What are your values? And it's interesting how sometimes situations elucidate your values,
Yep.
even if you don't say it explicitly.
Yep.
What drew you to PTSD research?
I think partly it was my advisor. That was her program of research. I wanted from an early age I thought I was going to be a clinician. I guess I should start there. I thought that I wanted to do both clinical work and research. And it was actually on my graduate school interviews, they would ask me about my interests, and I would go on and on about my research interests. And they'd say, well, what about your clinical interests? And
You're like, what?
I would just say, well, I want to help people. No, literally, that's what I said. I was right out of undergrad. And so that kind of elucidated my values and made me realize I didn't want to do clinical work maybe. But all of my interests research-wise were those questions about vulnerability for mental health struggles, with the ultimate goal of improving treatment and prevention. So I was always really fascinated by that.
Why were those your interests?
I don't know.
Well, okay, I'm going to take this a specific part of your book, Minds Over Monsters, where you talked about a Sarah who was mute for 3.5 years. I don't necessarily want to draw direct lines. But there's a part of me that assumed that some element of your life experience led you to be interested in how those things unfold, psychologically speaking, from a neuroscience perspective.
Yeah.
Am I in the ballpark?
I'm sure, yes. So I have struggled with a significant amount of anxiety in my own life. We were talking before the recording about in psychology, we like to say research is me search, and that we're drawn into trying to understand our own selves. And it's interesting that I didn't even think to respond to that.
I don't want to say it out loud, but thank you for self.
I think it's partly because as a young child, I was very confident, and I would not say high anxiety, and so when I think back, I don't know, I feel like the adolescent part was, and the college part was almost like an exception to the earlier me. I think is why I didn't think of that, but for sure, I could draw that line.
Well, so okay, you said it's an exception, but tell me the whole arc. Did you see yourself as confident in both the pre-adolescent and college years, and this was a weird blip?
Yeah.
And if yes, why?
That's a good question too. I wrote a paper.
You're a real academic. You're going to hit me with a peer review. Okay.
No, it's not peer review. It was an essay for my women's studies class.
Okay.
Where I analyzed this trajectory. And I think it was puberty. I think it's the hormones.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in some young people in my own life where it's the whole Reviving Ophelia Society and what we do to young women.
Say that again?
Reviving Ophelia.
Maybe I don't know that.
Is a kind of popular nonfiction book dating myself, probably early 90s, was bestseller. It was called Reviving Ophelia, and it was essentially about...
I was living in a different country at the time. So.
About how young women start out in their childhood often very self-confident and extroverted and all of these things, and then gender roles and society's expectations of women just squashes them or drowns them in a river like Ophelia, and what we can do about that. And so I think it was like junior high, puberty years, and I think part society, part hormones, just get very self-conscious.
But then you talked about, I think, if I remember correctly, it was maybe the later years of high school where one or a couple of teachers, by kind of putting you in situations where you had to face that anxiety, it helped you confront it.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So one of the interesting things I found in Mind Over Monsters was the discussion of that, but then the later discussion of trigger warnings. And some of the debates around that.
Yeah.
Without spoiling the ending for everybody, summarize for me that both discussions. And I do have some thoughts in it. I was really fascinated by, maybe just because I had read that Jonathan Haidt article as well and read the book, and it was a time when certainly those trigger warnings and microaggressions were talked about more. And so you've addressed that backlash directly. So tell us a bit both about how you describe it in your book.
Sure. So I, as you had said, I was very quiet in high school. I didn't really talk. People thought they thought I was Mormon, and I wasn't allowed to talk to people or wear skirt or wear pants because...
You say you were Mormon?
Yeah, that's what they thought. Yeah.
Oh, they thought you were. Oh,
yes,
okay.
Yes. There was a rumor that was what was quote unquote wrong with me, which there's so many levels there, right? That we could. Yes. Because I went to Catholic school, so we had uniforms. But on what we call dress down days, I would wear environmental t-shirts and hippie skirts. So I wasn't big on pants. And I also didn't talk to people or go to parties that I wasn't invited to.
So everyone should accept blame for that particular data point.
Exactly. Anyhow, they did not talk to me very much. It's very quiet. And then in college, I never said a word. And I was one of those people that you write on their paper, would love to hear some contributions in class. This would be great. I'd love to hear some of these thoughts. But I found most of the time instructors would have like 20% attendance participation part of the grade.
Which is high.
Yeah, well.
Anyway, sorry, Dad. You carry on.
But then they would just give me my A at the end of the semester. Anyway, even though I never said a word. But then I picked up a women's studies minor, and those instructors, you think 20% is high, it would be something like 40% of the class is discussion.
Right.
And they were, in the beginning of class, would say, you may have other classes where you just get your A without talking. Like, this dialogue is what this class is. Like, we have to.
Class makes no sense unless you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I was one of those students, we all have had some of them, who was not going to get the A. And so just kind of forced myself, which is not all students would be capable of doing who struggle with anxiety. I'm not saying that, and it was horrible. Like, I had stomach ailments, like I could hear it roaring in my ears and my own heartbeat. But I would participate a little bit here, a little bit there. And then lo and behold, it got easier every time I did it. And now I'm a teacher, public speaker. And a lot of the talking I do with faculty when I'm talking to them about the Mind Over Monsters and about supporting student mental health is about that fact. And then we know that from hundreds of years of psychology that the best thing for anxiety is small exposures to what you're afraid of in a safe setting, which is important to emphasize. It's not just shock and awe.
Right.
It has to be, and this will lead us into the trigger warning debate.
Right.
Shock and awe does not work. That there needs to be this grounding of safety, and then you take these risks and you see you're okay. And you take another risk and you see you're okay. And you get more and more comfortable.
Maybe I should think about that next time I go to a roller coaster park with my son. Because up until this point, I just tell him I'm allergic.
Well, but then, I mean, that brings
and
us
I'll
into
continue to be allergic.
That brings us a little bit into the trigger warnings debate, because we have to, and in the book, I interview a clinical psychologist, Ellie Romero, and they really encouraged me to think about the students' values. So it was a value to me to engage in that dialogue. I was headed into a career in higher education. I knew that. I wanted my PhD, where I would have to give talks at conferences. I would have to be doing sorts of public speaking. And so it was important to me to overcome that fear. If you don't like roller coasters, you don't have to like roller coasters, Brian.
I think you're still judging me, though. I was seeing your eyes right now.
No, I'm not a big fan of roller coasters either. So, and I think that's important to keep in mind with our students. I've read work by our mutual friend, Vijay Sathi, who also didn't like to talk in college classes, but it wasn't a value to her. At least she didn't want to. And so I think forcing students into something that is not important to their values is not good education either.
Yeah, and I think that maybe in a nutshell is where I struggled with the way the debate was framed. And this is something I think is actually, to me, was bigger than just the trigger warning discussion itself. It's a problem I've seen happen in academia quite a bit. I like to call it pendulum swinging.
Yes.
And so if you surmise that there's an overuse of the term safe space or there's an overuse of trigger warnings, then somehow that turns into a whole broad brush sweep of all of higher ed, and every kid everywhere is being cuddled.
Yep.
And I don't understand the intellectual laziness of how can you just say everybody is one thing? Right? I mean, without any nuance, without any qualifications of that. And so in so doing, I think it does several things. Well, one thing it does, I think, is it complicates what to me is actually a relatively socially simple situation, right? If I am interacting with you and discussing something can cause a reaction from you, if I love you, if I even like you as a person, I would think twice about how I engage you with that.
Right.
Right. And that's a separate discussion to if you have some anxiety you need to address, there's a mechanism to address that. That doesn't need to impact like what I do. I'm just trying to make you comfortable so that when you're here, you could be your best self.
Right.
Like, why does that have to turn into a thing? It was kind of amazing. And I don't want to make too many assumptions here, but I feel it had a little bit of an air of, in my day, this is not how college was kind of feel to it.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And then so you yeah.
We share this pet peeve. The pendulum, false dichotomies. We just constantly do. Either you're this or you're that. Either you're pro trigger warning or you're anti trigger warning.
Right.
And I think you're raising this tension that in the book I present this case that many people might read as a really good case against trigger warnings.
Right.
That we need to expose
Right.
people to things that they're afraid of. But again, it was my choice, right, to start. I mean, there was that nudge with the grade, but I was opting into this, and it's only ever going to work if that's the case. And the trigger warning thing also gets me upset because there's just so much folklore to it. So you mentioned the Haidt article, and I tried to trace back. There's a couple anecdotes in that for people who haven't read it, it's an Atlantic, I think, essay is the one you're referencing.
Yeah.
And there's a couple anecdotes in there. But then if you read even academic articles on trigger warnings, will have this same narrative where they start and they say, and this first part is true, that trigger warnings emerged in the 1980s on like listservs and it was mostly women who had suffered sexual assault. And this kind of concept came up. It kind of spread with the internet. And then it started migrating to classrooms. And then students started asking for trigger warnings for ridiculous things, And when they get to that last part, they always cite the Haidt article, which is just a couple anecdotes that his buddies told him. And there's no academic evidence. And in the book, I interview Alison Cares, who's a sociologist, who's actually trying to collect that data. To what extent are people using trigger warnings in their classes? What kinds are they? What effect they seem to have on the student? And so she's trying to actually get some data on that.
Right. And what I gather, you have to tell me if you had talked about this in the book or not. I can't remember. But there are times when people do trigger warnings without necessarily calling them or even thinking of them as trigger warnings.
Ding, ding.
This is just what I understand that this is a thing we're going to talk about that's pretty tough to talk about. So could we just do a little bit of prep work? It's no big deal.
Yep.
No big deal. I don't need the care police to come running in, right? Like and you may not call it that, but that you're effectively doing the same thing, right? You're giving people a chance to opt out or ramp or get a sense of what's coming, have a discussion before, right?
Yes, one of my favorite cases, it was a Psychology Today blog, and I couldn't even throw the person under the bus if I wanted to because I don't remember their name. But I read the whole thing, and it was like a screed against trigger warnings. And then 3/4 of the way through the blog, he said, here's what I do instead. If we're going to talk about something that involves like violence or, I'm going to show a clip in class, I let students know that we're going to be doing that.
So you do I
intellectualize why we're doing it, even though it's violent or upsetting. I offer for students, if anyone's really upset, that we could go out and get coffee and like talk about the topic instead. And that's what I do instead of giving a trigger warning.
So instead of
That's
giving
like
a
the most
warning,
detailed trigger warning.
you give an even more detailed trigger warning than the ones you
It's
hear.
so much more elaborate than any trigger warning I've ever given.
Let me ask you this about Mind Over Monsters, maybe even Hive Mind to a certain extent. And this, my feeling when I read your work is I always feel like there's a central thesis to your work. And maybe you feel, all writers perhaps have that, right? But you don't say it, I don't think you say it explicitly in either book, in that it feels like you're asking higher ed to care about students as people.
Mm-hmm.
And like if I had to put like a one sentence preface to both of those books, it's that.
Oh, lovely.
And in doing so, here are things you need to understand, right? And so for me, that context matters because maybe I shouldn't say I worry, but in my discussions across the country, it's a bit of a step, right? Especially with STEM faculty, to kind of move them to a place where you're not just here because you're an expert at chemistry or physics or
Right.
whatever. Like, teaching is a humanistic activity, and understanding who's in front of you. There are things you need to learn about that. And I think your books kind of provide some language and some good, rich examples of that. Am I right? Is that the preface to what made all of this writing important to you, and to who's reading your book?
Yeah, I love that you read that. that comes through. I absolutely agreed. To me, it seemed that part seems so basic and central that I don't know if I would describe that as the central thesis, but maybe that's because it is the central thesis, right? It's just that we should see our students as human beings with really rich lives and motivations and complexities. It just should be such a given, I feel like.
But isn't that your bias though? I mean,
Yes, I think so.
exactly.
That's
You're
what I'm
somebody
saying.
who grew up in musical theater, and like it's just so basic to how you exist.
Yeah.
You almost just assume, like, well, of course that's what you do.
Right,
The people
right.
in front of you, right?
Yeah.
And as we know now, right, this is an explicit conversation that needs to take place.
Yeah.
And it surprised me too, right, when I started to realize like the ways in which we've been taught what teaching should look like at the college level.
Right, right.
Yeah, no assumptions here.
I also would say that I feel like a central theme, what I thought you were going to say, which maybe is just a variation on what you did say, is that not just our students are people, but that we are people and that we're people together. Like the emphasis on the collective and the sense at which in a classroom, it's not about us, the instructors, and them, the students, and how we interact, but that it's in us, right? Like there's one being there almost, that our fates are intertwined, that success is intertwined, and that our emotions are going to affect each other, our motivations, our goals for the course, things that are going on in the periphery are going to affect it. And so this is really my fascination with when I wrote Hive Mind, is the sense at which human beings are individuals, but we're also collectives. And that there's all sorts of fascinating stuff that happens at that collective level, intellectually, emotionally, biologically. And that, I think, is what I'm truly fascinated by. But it's not distinct from our students, our people. They're almost like it changes the nature of what we're doing. We're striving together.
Let me build on that for a second, because it ties into something I've been thinking about a lot recently. So that whole notion of collective, it can mean a lot of things. It can change context almost daily. Just to use myself as an example, right? I'm born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. I've been here for 25 years. Still think of myself as an immigrant, but I'm a citizen. I'm of African descent, but my lineage, followed a different journey than African Americans. And so how and when I feel part of a collective really differs depending on what day you talk to me.
Sure.
Right? And I think overall that's a good thing. It if anything, it sort of highlights the beauty of relatively fluid immigration patterns, the breaking down of borders, being able to connect across cultures, et cetera, et cetera. But there is this side of it where, because of that, right, there's just a lot of things in a salad.
Yeah.
How does that reality impact your own thinking of collective?
Right. So it is, I think this is true of not just your experience, obviously.
I'm the only one.
I mean, we're constantly fluxing in and out of collectives and who we feel a collective with. And I think who we spend a lot of time with also has profound implications on who we are as people, that we change based on who we're spending a lot of time with. And it influences my thoughts about education, because that for me is an entry point to the whole conversation about inclusion. who's joining the collective of a class and
Right.
who feels still out on the periphery. Like, oh, all these and sometimes it can even a class that's going well for some students that might even be worse for other students, because if you observe that there is this kind of bonding almost happening with a subset of the
Right,
class,
right,
and you're just over here feeling isolated, that's worse than being in a kind of meh class,
Right, right.
and so it influences how I think about inclusion and belonging, and how can we think strategically about being sure that we're bringing everyone into that experience.
Yeah. It's almost as though if you see like visual markers of you being excluded, it
Right.
pushes you even further away. So how does that discussion go? Like when I'm trying to translate this for faculty members who are listening, right, and who are thinking about their classrooms. What does that discussion sound like? Because one of the things you do here at Simmons University is that you're a faculty developer, educational developer. So I'm sure you've had this conversation several times. What does it sound like?
Right. Well, I think an entry point with faculty is trying to get practical about it and give strategies for, I know there's a certain like animosity toward like tips and tricks in faculty development, but I think that describing what we were just discussing in so many of your other podcast episodes about having goals of inclusion and increasing belongingness and all of that, faculty members will hear that and feel attracted to it, but they need something to do, right? And so I think giving them structural strategies for getting to know all of your students as people, varied things from, Tracy Addy's Who's in Class surveys to inviting all of your students into your office for one-on-one chats. I think being very structural in terms of how you do discussions in class, because if you just say, okay, turn and find a partner, that's an easy way to leave people out. And so having people count off, having people have roles, having different ways for students to participate, because some students, it's good to welcome them, such as my instructors did to me, to join the whole group discussion. But having other ways, whether we're reporting out on their phones that shows up on the screen, whether they're at small boards together.
Because sometimes they don't necessarily want to like do the talk to somebody
thing,
right? I mean, people who know me, I guess, professionally speaking, a lot of people assume I'm an extrovert. But there's a big part of my personality where I just enjoy being with myself. And especially like I go to lectures or, as you've probably seen, the new thing in higher ed when you go to conferences is the active learning bug has now taken talks. And now talks are expected to be. And I'm not trying to throw shade here, but sometimes when they say, okay, talk to your neighbor, I don't want to talk to my neighbor. You have 20 minutes, man. I'm not trying to but I get it. And I understand it comes from a good place. But there are also space for people who, maybe can contribute in a different way or just would like to sit in silence and hear your thoughts. You ended the book, Mind Over Monsters, maybe with a different way, offering a different way for us to think about monsters that I thought was very compelling. And tell me if I'm getting this right?
Remind me, because I don't remember.
We're going to quiz you on your book. On page 150, so it'll come to you once I make an attempt here. Okay. But it seemed to me that what you were suggesting is, unlike the monsters at your grandmother's house, which perhaps presented itself as something to fear and avoid, or maybe even defeat. Think of monsters as things that are with all of us every day, and they are part of who we are. And they are not a thing to be getting rid of per se. They are a thing to be negotiated and to live with.
Yep.
And so if you look at it that way, if you're a teacher, and even for yourself, right, look at it that way, then you're less seeking to exorcise and you're more seeking to create an environment that allows that living with to be as palatable as possible.
Yep.
How did I do?
Good. You reminded me. I was like, oh yeah, we end with Grover. Yeah, the monster at the end of the book.
As somebody who grew up on Sesame Street and can still sing half of the songs,
Yep.
yeah, that was perfect in every way, Paul. You have no idea.
100%. And I think, another fascination of mine is horror films. Not like Saw, torture, nasty stuff, but like ghosts.
Because you'll pass out.
Yes, exactly.
In a bar.
Yes. It's a whole other story. But ghost stories. But I think if you look at so many of our ghost stories, film and short stories, novels, monster, and there's a whole world. I love this about doing creative nonfiction because you were all in our academic silos. And I thought this great idea. Oh, I had this idea that monsters are important, for how we understand our psychology. And then there's whole people with PhDs in monster theory. Yeah. That was the most fun part of the book, was doing that research, reading those books and those theories. But I think it's just true of humanity that we have these monster theories because it's what we're afraid of. A lot of it's mortality, a lot of it's losing loved ones, a lot of it is how gross it is to be bodies that just slowly deteriorate over time.
What about monsters that tie a bit more umbilically to our vulnerabilities? So I'm thinking specifically of one of my favorite books, because I'm a fan of dystopias, 1984. And you might remember, I don't know if you read that book or not, but one of the things they did, I remember, was they knew what your biggest fear was.
Yep.
And so when they took you to that room, right,
Rats.
I think in that case, right, the rats came and they would eat it, Don't want to trigger my audience telling that, but it's a great book, by the way. But I see that as a little bit of a different kind of monster than, say, the monsters of the unknown, right? How does that type of monster play into how you think about mind over monsters?
Right. Well, I think that we all have particular monsters, right? Particular things that really get under our skin, and that says a lot about us. Not to get too Freudian, but that you can kind of do an analysis of what someone's fear is, and there's usually a history there. But even when there's not, it, I think, says something about the central struggles of their life.
Do you feel like your mind has completely subsumed your monsters?
No. It's a lifelong dance.
Yeah,
with
I mean,
your
there was no
monster,
correct answer to
with
that,
your
right?
monster, right?
Yeah.
I think it's one of the rare advantages of aging that I think things do get easier monster-wise. There's a bit. So my particular struggles is with panic disorder, and I was reading, I think, one of the research articles for Monster, and they were like, that panic disorder is one of the few anxiety disorders that tend to decline sharply as you get older, and it's basically because it's just all too mushy in there. Like the systems are less able to do what they're so like your heart, because panic disorder, your whole body freaks out at the same moment. Your heart speeds up. And, it's like your body's like, it's probably fine. It's probably fine. I'm not going to get worked up.
We have other things to worry about.
Yes.
Going on this stage is not one of it.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why I ask is, selfishly, like when I read this stuff, one of the things I like about reading, especially books like yours, is it helps you reflect on your own life, about things that maybe you didn't have language for until you read a book that said, oh, this is what it could look like, this is what it could mean. And, I didn't use the M word, right? I didn't call any of these things monsters, but to your point about age being a blessing in some sense, well, it's not just age, it was also, I dare say even being an academic, right?
Yeah.
Gave me language to understand things that happened to me in my teens, right? My 20s, right? Why did the 20-year-old Brian, who almost failed Morehouse College, not go to office hours for a whole semester, even though they were there and they were on the syllabus, right?
Yeah.
But now you see why, right? And then when you have that understanding, you almost feel a sense of privilege and responsibility to make that environment a little bit different for the students you're blessed to teach, because you see what they could go through if you don't do that.
Right.
And this is where teaching is a blessing and a privilege.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'll get you here on this one.
Uh-oh.
Why you have to drink water before the lesson? As if it's going to be the hardest question. What was your favorite
Preparing.
musical? You did musicals. What was your
Oh.
favorite?
That I did, or my favorite musical in general?
Do both.
Okay, both. That I did was Oliver. I think
Okay.
I was the funeral director's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was really about the ensemble. It was really about who I was doing it with
Mm-hmm.
and just the emotional experience. What's my favorite musical? My favorite guilty pleasure is Moulin Rouge.
Okay.
I know it's very melodramatic and over the top. And I think maybe more my... Yeah, let's just go with Moulin Rouge. I'm not going to judge myself. There we go. Moulin Rouge.
You haven't said that means that you are. But so I was in the band that would support the musical.
Oh, nice.
And my favorite was one. I'm blanking on the name, but the rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain.
I know that saying, but I don't
Yeah,
know
so
what
it's from
Yeah,
a musical. They took this country girl and trying to teach
Yeah. Oh, is
her
it
the bourgeois.
Oklahoma?
Nah, I'm pretty sure it's not that one. Anyway, some listener might tell us.
Yeah.
But then the one that actually song gets stuck in my head. Some enchanted evening, you will meet a stranger.
Oh.
That's from I'm blanking. Oh, and no, my actual favorite. Scratch the Spain
All
one.
right.
HFS Pinafore.
Ah, yep.
Yeah, I was a musician for that one.
Nice.
That was great. Do you still do it?
I don't. I have kind of had on my bucket list doing community theater for a long time. But my daughter is in theater, and I'm the president of the Booster Club
I wonder who influenced her to do that.
that runs everything. So it's kind of, I'm not on stage, but I am very involved in the production. I'll tell you. It's like a separate full-time job.
you're
Yep.
you're one of those. In a good way.
Yep.
In a good way.
Yep.
Okay.
We're doing Little Mermaid right now. Yeah.
And Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are graciously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Thank you to Dr. Sarah Cavanagh for joining us today. Thank you for Simmons University for being an excellent host. Segev, we talked a lot about mental health. We talked about their own journey. You brought this up on the show before, how you've navigated this as an undergraduate.
I have, yeah.
How do you feel as you're looking at the exit door to your undergraduate career, in terms of how you manage your mental health and your success and being an engineering student and all of that?
I like to start by saying that when I started here in 2021, I was a much different person. Yes, I was still, trying to break out of my shell. The following year I took quite the hit with like classes, especially socially. But now looking back, like I've definitely, grown as a person, especially mentally. I'm able to handle things a lot better. And if there's one piece of advice that I can give to people who are also going through the same thing I did, lock in, go to the gym, and stay off your phone. Stop doom scrolling.
Well, I know how much. I mean, it's actually really good research now about the impacts of phones, right?
Right.
Interesting that your first thing was go to the gym. Would you say, just one quick question, would you say FIU as an institution have done things that helped you in that regard? Well, whether it's teaching or support services or whatever. Can you articulate any of that?
I wouldn't exactly attribute it entirely to FIU, but more so the fact that I was in a different environment than what I grew up in back in Haiti.
Yeah.
There were a lot more opportunities for me to meet people, connect with people, network, and just plan things after. So couple that with meeting the right people, and it just goes up from there.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, I'm glad it did, and I'm glad you all joined us for today's conversation. I wish you the best of mental health. I wish you the best summer as we morph into that time period. And I just wish that all lessons that Dr. Cavanagh shared with us about how we as an institution, as instructors, as leaders, can create these environments for our students to thrive. I just hope you continue to do that. Have a great week and be excellent to each other.
A lot of the talking I do with faculty when I'm talking to them about the Mind Over Monsters and about supporting student mental health is about that fact. And then we know that from hundreds of years of psychology that the best thing for anxiety is small exposures to what you're afraid of in a safe setting, which is important to emphasize. It's not just shock and awe.
Right.
It has to be, and this will lead us into the trigger warning debate.
Right.
Shock and awe does not work. That there needs to be this grounding of safety, and then you take these risks and you see you're okay. And you take another risk and you see you're okay. And you get more and more comfortable. I feel like a central theme, what I thought you were going to say, which maybe is just a variation on what you did say, is that not just our students are people, but that we are people and that we're people together. Like the emphasis on the collective and the sense at which in a classroom, it's not about us, the instructors, and them, the students, and how we interact, but that it's an us.